Right, morning once again. Welcome to the Network Engineering Booster, where we'll be discussing specifically task number 2, which is due in the next couple of days, as far as your network engineering POE is concerned. Now, you've got virtual machines that you need to be running as far as this particular assessment there is concerned, specifically mimicking or literally emulating a client server kind of network infrastructure. Same difference would apply with directory-based configurations there. So specifically, you're supposed to be running about 5 machines within your virtual environment, specifically 2 servers, and then 3 clients, right? So one particular server is going to be your main domain controller, and then the other one is going to be a member server, literally also acting as a backup or replication server, especially for the Active Directory domain platforms there. And then obviously the 3 clients. I think you possibly are going to be using one of them in terms of showing the appropriate configuration as far as this particular client obviously joining the domain and obviously being part and parcel of the actual setup at large. So here's the thing. When it comes to your virtual platforms, you've got 2 distinctive setups, right? You've got a type 1 hypervisor, and then you also have a type 2 hypervisor. I think the main differences between the 2 naturally is that one is part of the system, arguably also known as bare metal, and then the other one is literally running on the software platform or literally a third-party type of configuration. So you're distinctly not limited in terms of which particular hypervisor you use, right? Because at the end of the day, what you're supposed to be illustrating as far as this particular task is concerned is your ability to virtualize machines or your ability to run computer systems within the virtual environment, or literally illustrate your understanding of what virtualization is all about by obviously working at it from a practical perspective, right? So you've got Hyper-V, which is the one that is associated with being part of the system. Literally, it's shipped with Windows operating systems, specifically Windows 10 Pro, not Home rather, but Pro, Enterprise, or Education. Unfortunately, if you're running home, then you don't have access to Hyper-V. In that particular scenario now, you can use a type 2 hypervisor or a third-party type of hypervisor, and VirtualBox becomes your default go-to in that environment. So whatever you can do in Hyper-V literally can be done in VirtualBox and vice versa. You'll obviously find a couple of schools of thought having an inclination towards VirtualBox because of it being a bit more flexible and having less limitations in terms of the types of operating systems that you can run there as far as the actual system at large would go. So like I was just mentioning to your colleagues yesterday, that should you be sitting with a machine that's running Windows 10 Pro, Enterprise, or Education, then you've got access to your Hyper-V. But if you're running home, then naturally VirtualBox becomes the default go-to. I think I'm pretty certain that you will not be penalized for obviously not using Hyper-V as far as basic configurations they are concerned, because at the end of the day, obviously, what you're also submitting is the screenshots of configuration, not necessarily the actual setup as far as, or the actual platform that you're using at large in that regard. So with Hyper-V now, what you need to do is turn on the feature, because it obviously comes as part of the actual operating system, right? So you need to turn on the feature in the control panel. We'll have a quick look at that in a moment or so. And then once that is done, your system will obviously reboot. Once it's rebooted, then naturally you can have access to the Hyper-V manager, which obviously enables you now to create your virtual machines and dictate exactly how resources are going to be allocated across both the physical machine, which is also known as your host, as well as the guests, which are your virtual machines. And then when it comes to obviously VirtualBox, it's just a question of downloading it directly off the Oracle website. You can download the latest version. So whether you're using Windows 10 or the Windows operating system generically, doesn't necessarily just have to be Windows 10. You're using Mac or you're using Linux, you'll find that there are executables or files that are there for you to use. So you've got a download for Mac, you've got a download for Linux, you also have a download for Windows as well. So across whichever platform that you're using, you've got access to VirtualBox in that regard. Now, one of the other things that is also important before you undertake this particular assessment, if you've already started, good to go, is the fact that you need to have the right resources from a hardware point of view, right? So remember, what you're doing is setting up a machine within another machine. So resources that you've got are shared across the machines, both within the physical sense as well as the virtual environment. So you're sitting with your laptop or your desktop, you're sitting with about 8 gigs of RAM. You've got obviously a processor that can virtualize. You also have X amounts of free space as far as your hard drive is concerned. Whatever resources that you've got for your physical machine, which is the host, are also used by the virtual machine. So it's important to have the right amount of RAM. I think I've also mentioned this to your colleagues yesterday that as a minimum, sitting with 8 gigs of RAM would be doable for your setup. Why? Because obviously the moment you start running, because you'll need to run both servers naturally at the same time, and you also need to then run one of the clients. So in that scenario, you've got RAM that is spread across those virtual machines. You also have RAM that is associated or should be available for your physical machine or your host. And at the same time, storage spaces across the different platforms that you've got in that regard. So this could be a bit detrimental for you in terms of successful completion of the actual assessment itself, because if you don't have the right amounts of RAM, the right type of processor, the right storage space associated with your environment, then you could find that your machines might end up crashing, sometimes not even boot at all, and becomes a bit detrimental. And Hyper-V is a bit picky when it comes to that kind of scenario. With VirtualBox, you can get away with minimalistic kind of resources. But with the Hyper-V, it becomes a bit tricky because it's it becomes more of a cat and mouse kind of setup, where you might need to then start your Hyper-V before starting everything else on your machine. And then once your machines are running, then possibly can you open a browser or open a Word document and so on, so that at least the resources that are left over are applicable for the other applications, but the main resources are there for the actual virtual machine. So it becomes a bit of a cumbersome process. So if you're sitting in a scenario where you have limited resources, you might want to use the machines on campus. I think every one of the machines on campus can accommodate for a successful installation of the OSs and whatnot, and has the appropriate resources in that regard. So you might want to pop in if you're sitting with that particular situation, as far as resources would go. And then what else, before we jump in, the other thing is, or before we start looking at it from a practical point of view rather, or illustration point of view, the other thing is the softwares, right? So your assignment specifically lists your Windows Server 2012 Release 2 or R2, right? That's for the server software. And then for the clients, they've mentioned that you've got Windows 8.1, right? So alternatively, you can use, or you're allowed to use, Windows Server 2016. And you can also use Windows 10 as your client. So Windows Server 2016 for the server, Windows 10 for the actual clients, right? And one of the other things as well that you need to remember, whether you stick with what has been specifically listed in the assignment, what I've just mentioned a couple of seconds ago, as far as the actual client software is concerned, please make sure that you run either Pro, Enterprise, or Education. So this is for the actual client software. So whether you go with Windows 8.1, make sure it's Pro Enterprise or Education, and then whether it's Windows 10 you go with, make sure it's Pro Enterprise or Education. I'm sure most of you would have access to either Pro or Enterprise, which is still perfectly solid for the assignment or the task at large. And the reason behind this is that if you use Home in your assignment, then your client cannot join the domain. So remember, there's always a reason behind these specs, right? If you were to install Windows 10 Home or Windows 8.1 Home, it doesn't have features that allow you to join a domain. So then you become limited in that regard. At the end of the day, you will still need to then reinstall every which way. So just make sure that you've got the right config set up there as far as your virtual environment is concerned. And remember, you're running ISOs, right? Because for any one of you who's installed software before, whether it's an application package or an OS, you normally download a package and then you double click or you run the setup file, right? But when it comes to a virtual environment, that software is packaged as an actual disk, right? Which is literally your image, or an actual DVD if you want to look at it from a different point of view. So it's mimicking optical media if you want to look at it from a different point of view. That's what an image is all about. So in your virtual environment, you're actually running an image as opposed to running a setup file. So just make sure that if you're obviously going to be downloading this the softwares that you need, you download as an ISO a format for both client and naturally the server software that is there as far as your environments would go. So I think that covers that, right? In terms of what it is that you need to take into consideration in terms of formatting or the format of submission. I'm sure your tutor or your lecturer should have covered that with. It's just a question of you obviously having a student number. I think here it says your folder should have your student number underscore module name. And then within that particular main folder, you've got other subfolders that are labeled in accordance to the actual activity. So obviously question 1.1, question 1.2, all the way to question 2.4. And what you're doing as far as submission is that in each one of these folders, you're going to be plugging in screenshots, right? And literally these screenshots will now confirm or literally provide evidence of you having configured the server accordingly, or you having literally set up your virtual machines. The list will go on and on. So these screenshots would also need to include the actual name of your machine, and also even look at your domain, right? Because otherwise, at the end of the day, one person can just complete the assignment and literally just share screenshots across the actual groups there as far as this particular program is concerned, right? So to make sure that this is your particular screenshot, the actual name of your virtual machine should be shown, and even the domain as well that is associated with your environment should be applicable in that regard. I think we can also have a quick look at that as well as we go through the actual session itself. So today is going to be a bit of a summarized type of setup. Like I said before, yesterday's session was a bit more lucid or in depth, if you want to look at it from a different point of view. Like I said before, just finished editing that one. So I'll also pop in, I'll send you the links a little later on. I mentioned yesterday to the guys that attended that by the end of the day. But obviously, with the load shedding scenario that we're all experiencing, that can be a bit of a tall order, right? So hopefully, by the conclusion of today, I think both groups, or all groups rather, should distinctively rather have a link to that. So Hyper-V would be my focus. There's already a clip on installation running VirtualBox, so how to install your machines on VirtualBox. Again, with that one, will be provided to you before the conclusion of the day. And then what else before we quickly jump in as well? I think that's pretty much it. Oh, with the screenshots, please make sure you use the snipping tool. because you've got scenarios where students end up using, or candidates end up using their phones, for instance, to take screenshots. The problem with that is, again, not as solid or professional as you'd want it to be if you want to look at it from a different perspective. And in most instances, these particular screenshots that are typically elucidated using your phones or your cameras are not as legible in certain instances. So I think that kind of becomes a problem, because what you also want to avoid is that whoever is going to be marking your assessment does not have trouble finding your information. Neither do they have trouble actually making sense of what it is that you've submitted, right? So just make sure you use the snipping tool. Every Windows operating system on the planet literally ships with the snipping tool. And that's if you're using a Windows machine. I'm not so sure which particular applet is used on a Mac setup, but I guess same difference still applies, even if you're using a Linux as well in that regard. So just make sure that you try and use the snipping tool there, so that at least it's a more professional type of submission. And at the same time, your images are ultimately clear, right? As far as your particular setups is concerned in that regard. So I think that's pretty much that as far as your configuration would go. So with Hyper-V, as well as VirtualBox, actually, if you look at it from a holistic point of view, most machines will need to have virtualization enabled in BIOS before you start running your virtual machines. Because remember, if you want to look at it from a very simplistic point of view, virtualization is all about just running multiple operating systems concurrently or simultaneously or at the same time. So what avails for that is the processor as well, because there's always that relationship between the actual OS and your central processing unit, as far as your machines they are concerned. So most systems would need for you to log into BIOS. So depending on the machine that you're using, the BIOS or the setup key is different across the different machines that are there. If in your personal environment, find out what that particular key is, log into that. Once you're in there, you need to find virtualization. Normally it's listed as virtualization technology, and you'll need to make sure that it's enabled. If you're using AMD, that's obviously on an Intel platform. AMD, I think they are listed as VX, if I'm not mistaken. Also, you need to ensure that that is enabled in order for you to run it accordingly. And then so that's for some machines, but obviously some of them are automatically activated by default. So you shouldn't have problems in that regard. With a Mac, if you're using the M1 chips, that could be a bit tricky, because some of these are not configured for virtualization in the first place. So that could be a bit problematic, if I'm not mistaken. I think we've had instances in the past in that regard. So that could be a bit tricky. If you're running a Mac on Intel processors or Intel chips, then you're good to go, because that should be available for you for virtualization. But with the M1 chips, I think there's a bit of I'm still on the fence on that one. In terms of the virtualization platform in that regard. Because obviously with Mac as well, what you can do is then also have the dual boot scenario, where you can literally just switch between Mac and the Mac OS and Windows, right? And then obviously be able to run it from that perspective. But then obviously if the chip itself cannot accommodate for virtualization, that can be a bit of a tall order as well in that regard. So I think that covers the basics in terms of what it is that you need in order for you to successfully complete the actual assessment at large in that regard. And then let me see if I can quickly share my screen here, so that I can show you specifics in terms of where to activate your Hyper-V if you're running your Windows platforms in that regard. So let me. Hopefully, my technology will play ball today. So there. All right. So I think sorted. Okay. So control panel. All right, so all you need to do here is just look for your control panel, and then in that control panel, what you want to then focus on is programs and features, right? In that particular setup, that enables you to actually activate or turn on the Hyper-V feature. So regardless of you using Windows 10 Pro, Enterprise, or Education, these features are not activated by default, because remember, if you walk into a store right now, if 5 of us buy a machine, more often than not, of the 5, possibly 0 is going to be virtualizing, right? So most often than not, you find that most of these particular features are not turned on by default. So you need to then turn them on if you need them, and then turn off if you no longer need, dependent on the setup that you've got. So once you've accessed your control panel, you're going to go with programs and features there. And then on your left-hand navigation pane, you should find turn Windows features on or off. So you're going to click on that. And then naturally, once that is done, the actual Windows features window appears. And then what you want to then select in that regard is Hyper-V. So obviously with this machine, it's already activated, but in most instances, you find that it's not selected. What you want to do is then make sure that you expand everything so that there's no grayed out options there. So once you expand the entirety of the Hyper-V feature there, it should show you management tools, the GUI management tools, your Windows PowerShell, the actual platform itself, which is the Hypervisor, and then the Hyper-V services. So all of these need to be ticked. If you find yourself with any grayed out sections where you can't literally select, then I suggest, like I mentioned a couple of moments back, to go back to your BIOS, ensure that you turn on or enable virtualization in that firmware platform, and then come back to try and obviously turn on the Hyper-V features in their entirety. So what this would then also mean is that once you've selected that, the moment you click on OK, naturally your particular machine would ask for a reboot after installation or after turning on those features. Accept that reboot. After the reboot, then naturally you should be able to access the Hyper-V manager. So how you'd access that, is in that section there. You can just type out, there's your Hyper-V manager as far as your particular setup there is concerned. So all you have to do is click on it, and ultimately you can then start working with your virtual machines in that environment. So I already have my Hyper-V running here. Unfortunately, it's going to be a bit slow there because the system is already overwhelmed, but at least it gives you a bit of an idea of what's happening. But before we actually look at this server, let's, I think this group, we didn't look at actually creation of the machines, right? So let's quickly see how we can create the machines themselves. So you've got the Hyper-V manager opened up, all right? So if you look at your left-hand navigation pane there, you find that you have the Hyper-V manager title there, and just underneath it, there's the actual desktop, which is the physical machine that you're using, right, to create your virtual machines. So you can obviously load as many virtual machines as you want, and literally load whichever OS is that are relevant in that regard. So once you click on, so what you need to do is, first of all, click on where your desktop is labeled there. Once you click on that, you find that there's an actions section on your right-hand side, which is also another navigation pane that is there. By default, if you open up your Hyper-V manager, normally you find that it's listed like that, right? So as you can see, there's no options that we've got in terms of functioning or literally looking at proper creation and so on of our particular environments in that particular instance. So what you want to do is ensure that you click on the actual desktop itself. Once you've clicked on that, you want to ensure that you can now work with creating new configurations in that regard. So you're going to click on where it says new there, right? And once you do that, you'll discover that we've got your virtual machine, your hard disk, and your floppy disk. So what we want to do is create a new virtual machine, right? So we're going to select new virtual machine there. All right, and there we go. So once you've selected that, you've got a wizard now where you can now dictate what's happening with your machines, and literally how much RAM you want to allocate, and where your particular virtual hard disk is going to reside, and obviously what type of operating system you're going to be using in that regard. So once you nexted, this is where you label your machine. So according to your assignment, I've already listed the two servers there. So according to your assignment here, the naming convention is, what is it again? It's your initials, your student number, and then underscore CLT, short for client, and then obviously the name and the number of the client in that regard. So I'm just going to quickly go again with the same convention that I used. So my initials, KG there, my student number is going to be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And then my, I'm going to put an underscore there. Oopsie, not the plus, but the underscore. And then I'm going to go CLT. So remember, you're going to be marked on this. So it's very important for you to make sure that you use the right naming convention. So that's my CLT or client number 1 there. Once I've done that, I'm going to next it. Generation 1, generation 2. So when you look at your installations, right, I think we should go back to understanding what's happening with such modules as your computer architecture and so on. When you look at basic installation, or when you look at the whole concept of managing your drives or understanding mass storage and so on, you've got MBR and you've got the later GPT configuration. And one of the other things you need to take into consideration there is that with systems, they upgraded from your 32-bit to the current 64-bit kind of setup, and certain limitations were experienced with 32-bit, right? Because you're limited in the amount of RAM that is accessible as far as the address bus there is concerned. So naturally, if you're looking at legacy architecture or legacy devices or legacy configuration, your generation 1 in terms of installation becomes the default go-to in that regard, because it can accommodate for both legacy as well as new architecture or technology, if you want to look at it from a different perspective. But on the other hand, when you look at generation 2, you're now looking strictly at the later technology. And remember, whatever generation that you select, you cannot change it at a later stage once your virtual machine has been created. So I normally advocate for you to just stick with generation 1, at least, because it accommodates both for legacy and, to a certain extent, newer technology type of guests with 32-bit versus 64. And naturally, instead of using the generic MBR configuration, your generation 2 normally looks at your unified extensible firmware interface, which is also known as your UEFI based type of configuration in that regard. So go with generation 1 there as far as your particular environment would go. And then this is where you dictate how much RAM you want to allocate as far as your particular machines would go. So this is where that a minimum 8 RAM or 8 gigs of RAM configuration comes in as a minimum, literally, because remember, there would be a possible moment in time where you obviously need to be running at least 2 machines at the same time in your virtual setup. So assuming you're sitting with 4 gigs of RAM and you've given 1 gig a piece, it means that when those 2 machines are running, then you're only left with 2 gigs to run the host or the physical machine. And remember, in reality, unless you're using a dedicated graphics card, normally you're not sitting with actually 4 gigs of RAM. It's about 3.89 something, because some of it is being allocated to the GUI component of your machine, right? So normally, even if you're sitting with 8 gigs of RAM, sometimes you'll find that it's not actually 8 gigs that is accessible. You've got about 7.89 or 7.9 thereabouts, because there's always going to be a minimal component that is allocated to the graphical user interface platform as far as your environment would go. So in that regard, it's important to make sure that that's the reason why I've been singing this song for a while now, to say you need the right amount of resources to make sure that at least your environment is not as glitchy. Because this assignment, in its entirety, I think this should take you proper sit down for this, and you don't have any unnecessary distractions. You're looking at least about 2 hours at most for you to complete the actual assignment at large, right? No distractions. Your machines are running perfectly. 2 hours, 3 hours if you're pushing it. but that's more than enough time for you to look at proper completion of your assignment at large. And what the other things that should dictate this is that, yes, I've got X amounts of the right X amounts of RAM, I've got a good processor, blah, blah, blah. If your hard drive is not SSD, doesn't mean that you can't run the assignment, but I'm just saying, if it's not SSD, then that process is going to be slightly longer because you're using a traditional drive. Remember, traditional drives use mechanical parts every which way. But if you've got an SSD now, your scenario is a bit better because your installation processes and configuration, you name it, becomes a lot faster in that regard, because you're not going to need the internet for this particular or internet connectivity for the assignment at large. So I think it's important to take cognizance of that fact as well, to say, if you're running with SSDs, you're in a better scenario as opposed to a traditional drive setup in that regard. So I'm going to leave it as 1024 there, which is the 1 gig. I'm going to next it there. Normally, the more RAM that you've got, the more you want to allocate, right? But be careful about this. So what I mean is, if you're sitting with 16 gigs of RAM, then at least you can allocate 2 gigs a piece to the 2 servers there. Obviously, when they're running all at the same time, it's 4 gigs that you've got plugged out. And even if you have one particular client that is also running, you can then have either 1 or 2 gigs allocated there. That becomes 6 gigs a piece. Or in its entirety, rather, that leaves you with about 10 gigs of just under 10 gigs really of RAM that you can use. So your system should still be snappy. But again, remember what complements that RAM, what complements that processor is obviously going to be the SSD that you're using. So here's the switch. So remember, what you're actually doing in terms of the actual setup is, assume you're looking at a physical scenario. You've walked into computer room one day and you've got one particular physical machine, which is a server, another physical machine, which is a client. Instead of having a direct link between these two, you want to use a central device, which is naturally your switch, right? In that regard. So you plug in your switch in between. You've got a cable running from the switch to the server. You've got another cable running from the switch to the client. You've literally just created your own very basic client-server relationship in that regard, right? So in your virtual environment, we want to mimic that same physical scenario. So literally what it then means is that you want to dictate your switch in this regard. So if you don't have access to the default switch here, you can always create a switch using your virtual manager section here, right? But I'll show you that if you're having a difficulty in that regard, as far as creating your own switch that you can then use. But normally you find that by default you've got what they call a default switch. Make sure that this is the switch that you select for all your machines. Because what that would then mean is that you've got one particular, you're literally mimicking in a physical environment, one switch that is connecting all 5 of those machines, the 2 servers and the 3 clients, right? So make sure that, and if you're going to then create this, if you don't have the default switch listed in your Hyper-V setup, make sure that the virtual switch that you create is an internal switch, first of all, and it's the same switch that is obviously going to be used across all of your machines in that regard. So we're going to use default switch there. We're going to next step. The next section is going to be looking at where is your particular VHD going to be residing. Remember, every particular machine on the planet has a hard drive. In this particular instance, what we're doing is mimicking that physical setup with a virtual drive, which is literally a file on your physical hard drive that is mimicking, or that is literally availing for storage for your virtual machine. So that's what the VHD is all about. The actual expansion of that acronym is a virtual hard disk, right? As far as your particular setup is concerned. But obviously most of you are familiar with this content. And then normally the default location there is still fine for you as far as setups would go. Just make sure you've got the right amount of storage space in terms of capacity there. So because you don't want a scenario where when the machines are running, because more often than not, these VHDs are expanded as you use them. So normally they're dynamically configured. So you set up, for instance, here as an example, it's 128 gig, 127 gig rather. That 127 gig is populated as you use the machine. So it expands as you use the machine until I get to the maximum, which is 127. You can put that as 50, you can put it as 100, but as long as you've got the right amount of space that is there. If you're running VirtualBox, which you'll also have a quick look at when I send the clips in, there are two options when you come to this stage. The two options are dynamically allocated and fixed. When it's dynamic, the creation of the VHD is much faster, and the population of the actual VHD, just like I've mentioned a couple of seconds ago, is it increases as you use it. So as I run my machine, you might find that if I set it to 127 gigs as a typical example in this particular setup, as I use my machine, possibly I start using the first 10, then I go to 20, then after probably adding some rows or adding a few content there, I get to 60 gigs and so on and so on and so on. It's until I get to the 127, right? That particular platform literally expands as it's populated. But the other one now is a fixed storage option, which means that the moment I click on that or the moment I select that in my VirtualBox environment, automatically 127 gigs of my hard drive are reserved in its entirety for my machines. And obviously that particular setup becomes a bit more tricky because first of all, that particular space needs to be present or available. And secondly, it takes much longer to have that specific allocation removed from your physical drive, right? So just take cognizance of that. I think with your machines literally across 50 gigs that is doable across all the machines that you're using in that particular instance. But just make sure that you've got the right storage platforms in that regard, right? So we've mentioned that, leave it as the default. And this is a part that obviously also shows what's happening with your operating system and so on and so on and so on. So here you can leave it as installed operating system later. And then we can always specify where our particular OS is residing. So you next that, you've got a bit of a summary, you've got the name of the machine, the actual generation, the RAM, the switch, and so on. So with this as well, the naming, just assuming that you made a mistake with the name, you can always change it later. There's nothing wrong with that. The only thing in this particular summary that is tricky for you to change is the generation. You can still allocate more or less RAM. That's only if the machine is off, right? You can rename the machine while it's on, while it's running. You can also change the switch while your machine is running, but you can't change the RAM while it's running. You actually need to literally switch off or turn off the machine first. I mean, your virtual machine here, and then add more RAM should you need to, or remove RAM or deplete RAM should you need to, whichever way you want to look at. But the generation cannot be changed once the actual machine has been created. So just take cognizance of that particular fact. So the moment we finish, if everything goes according to plan, our particular virtual machine will now be listed under our virtual machine platforms in that regard. So if you can look at it closely, I've got that particular machine I've just created, which is off. My current server is running. I've got server 2 also off. But there you've got, so you also need a screenshot of this, right? Because this will show your tutor there or your lecturer that you've installed or used the right naming convention for your virtual machines. And then once that is done, you can now take screenshots within the actual machine itself to determine or to literally confirm the configuration in that regard. So that's how you create a virtual machine in Hyper-V. Like I said before, there's already a session there for VirtualBox. I'm not going to spend too much time on that one because you'll get the recordings soon after I conclude this one, hopefully, so before the end of the day. And then what I was mentioning, should you be in a scenario where you don't get the virtual switch or you didn't see the virtual switch for some odd reason, what you want to do now is, in that particular instance, you will then select Virtual Switch Manager. And then from there, you can create your own external, internal, or private switch. But obviously, internal will be a go-to, because remember, it's a local area network that you're literally setting up, right? So if I go with, internal switch there, I can then select my name there. So I'm going to go and say Kincaid test switch there, or we can say what, NWEG switch, right? So that at least it's more relevant. So NWEG switch there. And then obviously set to internal. Once that is done, you can either apply or okay, and then or okay directly, whichever way you want to look at it. So I'll okay that. And now I've got my NWEG switch that is also just internal. So you apply changes, and you'll see now on the settings of my machine that I've just created, because obviously you would have created it with a non-connect or with a not connected option, right? So let's assume I want to change that particular machine that I've just created to the actual switch that I've just set up. I can then just right click on it, go to settings, and then from the settings of my client one, as you can see, I've got that as a default switch. So normally sometimes, like I said before, should you not have default switch there, it will just list not connected or no switch present there. So I'll select that. And then here now, I can now go and select my NWEG switch, right? So once I've selected that, I can then just click on OK, and then I'm good to go. So that's how you can create your own personal switches there, should you not have the default listed in that regard, or any other time that you want to work with Hyper-V there. Because remember, the virtual setup or environment is quite lacquer in the sense. Why? Because what it means is you can literally play around with anything and everything here and not affect your physical machine. To get the logic. So let's assume you want to test a new operating system. You want to test your skills in programming. Maybe you want to work with Linux Kali, test your penetration capabilities in terms of hacking and so on, or you want to learn about security in that regard. You can literally break your machine in this environment and not affect your physical or your host. Right, that's the brilliance of virtualization. If you look at it from a different perspective, a perfect learning tool, and if it's used in the industry, you've got the other massive advantages that border from economic and energy saving setups, because instead of buying 5 servers, physical servers, right? I can just buy one very powerful one and then load my virtual machines inside of my other virtual servers inside that one, and still have a platform that can accommodate for whatever structures that we've got. I think even on campus, if I'm not mistaken, that's the kind of setup that is there, right? I think there are a couple of virtual servers that are kind of accommodating the setup that is there, right? And then the other thing is an energy saving configuration. So instead of 5 servers all using energy there, or you all using some power consumption, you've got one. Yes, you might argue that, but that main one is still using a lot of resources, but it doesn't equate to the 5 or the 4 additional servers that you've got from a physical perspective in that regard. So that's the creation of your machine. So here comes to the loading of the operating system. What you want to then do is that, first of all, on that machine that we've just created, right, you want to then right click and then select connect. And then once you've selected connect, what you want to do now is select your media. So from your media, this is where, so you're going to go and select media there. Go to your DVD drive. So remember, with installation of an operating system, you've got 3 specific methods or ways. You've got your DVD boot, which is the generic one that has been there for years on end. That's your using your optical media. Then you've got your image installation, which we were just talking about earlier on, especially with the virtual environments, but that can still also be used for an actual a physical machine, because you can still have your server within a network environment deploy that particular image across platforms. And then you've got a distribution share. So those are the 3. So remember, one of the other things, let me just digress for 2 seconds here. When you look at an image, it's not just the software, but the actual, you can look at an image of an entire computer system. So if you go to computer room 1, you've got all those machines that are there that are similar across, right? So the drivers are all going to be the same. And obviously even the application packages that are used are all going to be the same. So we can fully install one machine, right? So operating system, drivers, applications on one machine, fully install it, and then take an image of that same machine and then deploy it on the other remaining machines, because they're all the same model, same make, same everything. Cuts on time and makes installation a bit more seamless in that regard. So that's what the imaging platform is all about in that instance. So back to what we are logged in for here. So you've got your DVD drive, then you're going to select insert disk, right? So you're going to select that one. And then we're going to find, I think I've got my software on the desktop here. Yeah, so this is my software. So I'm going to double click on that, and then I can then select whichever software that I want to run. So it's a client, right? So I'm going to go with my Windows 10 multiple editions there, double click on that, and then obviously just confirm once more. As you can see now, it shows the eject option there. Once that is done, then I can select my start. And then once I select start, literally my operating system should load. So the choices that you've got for your OS, remember, you now need to specify your Windows 10 Pro or Enterprise, as well as education. And then you're looking at a custom installation. And then everything, next, you're good to go. For the server now, if you're running Windows Server 2012, right? Avoid a next scenario. There's a lot of individuals who look at these attended installations and act or behave as if they are unattended installations. With an attended install, you obviously are asked what next, right? So what to click, what type or which version, whether are you going to go with custom or upgrade? Are you also going to go with you obviously need to read the end user license agreements, right? So with Server 2012, you've got two options. You've got one which is just generically either a data center or your standard. What happens there is that the moment you click on that, your server will install, but to the command line, right? So it means that that particular server can only be used or cannot be accessed or can only be interfaced using your command line. So you want to avoid that. I'm not saying you're not capable of running it from the command line, but it's more of a cumbersome process now in terms of adding the roles, in terms of config, setting up your IP addresses, creating the users, blah, blah, blah. It's a much more cumbersome process unnecessarily. And I think we can all agree that while DUI takes a lot of resources, it's a more preferable type of interface to use. So what you'll do with Server 2012 Release 2 is select Server with GUI. So there's that option, right? Select Server with GUI, good to go. When it's 2016, instead, you'll find there's an option that lists there for both data center and standard desktop experience. So that's the option that you use. So for 2016, I'll say it again, your option will be desktop experience, which means that your machine will be installed to the GUI of your server. And then if you're using 2012, it's server with GUI. Make sure you don't forget those options when you're installing your machines. Right, so that's done and dusted in that regard. So I've already got one of my machines running here. Let's see if we can quickly run into it and then, or boot into it rather, and then just look at some of the configs here. Again, a bit of a summary, like I mentioned before, because you'll get a recording a little later on. The other thing is, we're all familiar with the whole networking setup, right? It's second semester, so you guys should be rather comfortable with the whole networking environment. So we all know there's server and client configurations. We all know that when you're looking at our models, we've got peer-to-peer, directory-based. We also have client server, right? Client, Windows 10, Windows 8.1, typical examples. If I walk into a store, if I go and buy my Windows 10, I come in and install it, I'm good to go. There's very minimal additional configurations that I need to run because it's a complete type of operating system or software, right? Yes, you can personalize this and that. You can change the displays, blah, 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 right? But you're using the machine as is. You're good to go. And most of the machines that you buy now literally are shipped with this particular OS. You just buy your laptop, buy your desktop if it's got an OS installed, and then you use it as is. But on the server side, installing Windows Server 2012, 2016, 2019, 2022 does not literally make your machine a server yet. Because remember, there are so many types of servers that are out there, right? You've got a web server, you've got proxies, you've got application servers, you've got your particular print servers. The list will go on and on. So what you need to do now is that once you've installed your server operating system, you still need to specify what type of server you want your machine to be. So this is where adding roles now comes in, right? I'm also going to send you a clip on that should you need to. So adding roles is you specifying what your computer system is going to, or what type of server your machine would be. When it comes to this assignment, you've got specific roles. You've got an Active Directory role, which means that your server needs to be a DC. You also have a DHCP role, which means that your server is automatically going to be dishing out IP addresses. You also have a DNS role, conversion or translation of IP addresses to fully qualified domain names. And then I think you also have a RAS, right, which is your remote and routing server, if I'm not mistaken. So those are the four roles. I mean, I'm just excuse the jumpiness there. I'm just speaking to you guys as well as I'm going through your document here, just to confirm. Right, so we've got DHCP, we've got DNS, and the DC, like I was saying earlier on, and then on page, what page is this one now? I think on page 17 of your document, that's where RAS is discussed here, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah, so you've got so those are the four roles, right, that you want to take into consideration. So this is just specifying what type of server you're going to go with, right? So when you install your server software, remember the default account there is administrator. It will ask you for a password. Stick with the password that you will remember naturally. I normally advocate for password 1 with a capital P. Remember, this is for your assignment, so you don't really have to go intricate on this one. But in the industry, naturally, you want to put more secure type of passwords that also need to be changed regularly to make sure that your environments are a bit more secure in that regard. But just go with password 1 with a capital P if you're in the habit of forgetting some of your passwords, so that at least it makes it a lot easier for you. Because if you can't log in, then it means you need to reinstall the machine itself. All right, so here I've got Control-Alt-Delete, right? So remember, when you're running your virtual environment, if you hit Control-Alt-Delete, it will take you to the host configuration. So to avoid that, what you want to do is you have an action option there as far as your Hyper-V is concerned. Click on that, and then you already have Control-Alt-Delete incorporated there. For VirtualBox, it's listed as Insert Control-Alt-Delete. So you go to your keyboard input, or you go to input and then select keyboard, and then you find Insert Control-Alt-Delete as an option in that regard. So I'm going to click on that, and then literally that is registered in the virtual machine. So I'm going to go with password 1 here, and then enter. I think that's the one I was using initially, and then we are good to go. We're logging into our to our server. So by default, you also find that when you log into your server, there's what is called the server manager that is also supposed to automatically pop up for you. Just click on yes there, right? And then if you find that your server manager doesn't automatically pop up, as you can see on screen there, you can always click on the Windows button and then select your particular set up in that regard. So this is what our server manager is all about. We've got our dashboard as the first thing. And as you can see, we can add the roles and features that are relevant in our particular environment. Now, before we start working on this, you need to make sure that when you look at any proper network configuration or setup, right, IP addresses need to be statically or manually assigned for servers, routers, and switches. All right, so in any particular network setup, you want to ensure that of the pool of IP addresses that are available, as far as setups are concerned, your server will be manually or statically assigned, your router, same different supplies, and then your switches. You want to avoid these particular intricate gadgets or the main gadgets of your network having to wait for a DHCP server to get an IP address every time you boot the network, every time the network is accessed, right? So if you're not familiar with that process, I'll go through it with you now to set up your particular manual IPs. So you're going to have your network icon at the bottom right in your task on your taskbar or your notification area there. You're going to right click on that. From the context menu that appears, you're going to select Open Network and Sharing Center. With this assignment, they didn't specify, right? But you want to go with the private IP addresses, all right? So either class A, B, or C. Make sure that you stick within a specific range and class. Don't go and select an IP address from class A and then set up your DHCP server with a range or a scope from class B or C, because automatically that misaligns your configuration there. How can your DHCP dish out a scope that it's not literally aligned with, if you look at the actual static IP address of your particular server? So remember, you've got your private addressing scheme configuration in that regard. So one of the other things as well is that if you look at, I think you're all familiar with IPv4 and IPv6, right? And the kind of situation and scenario associated with as far as those particular IP address configurations they are concerned, right? What I mean by this is obviously what you're distinctively looking at is that IPv4 inadequate now, obviously, and it's been inadequate for a couple of years, to be honest, because you've got a lot of you've got a lot of gadgets now that connect to the net, right? So what this literally means now is, as far as your particular setup is concerned, right? What it means is IPv6 was then created to accommodate for those shortcomings. Remember, IPv4, this is like back in the 80s. So the setup with IPv4, which accommodated for about 4 billion IP addresses, that was doable, because I think most of the experts, even at that time, might not have foreseen the massive growth of the net, right? So you've got now you've got appliances. I think I was telling your colleagues exactly the same thing yesterday. You've got appliances connecting to the net. You've got cars connecting to the net. You also have chips that can be plugged into human beings or animals that can connect to the net as well. So almost everything now connects to the internet. So to accommodate for that, obviously IPv6, but that's a bit of an issue there, because IPv6 is not replacing IPv4. It's literally it's not upgrading, rather it's replacing IPv4 in its entirety. So a bit of discrepancies there. That's the reason why you find that IPv4 is still a bit popular currently. So where I'm trying to get at is the reason why private addresses were created is to accommodate for better use of these already stringent IP addresses. So if I use a private IP address, I cannot connect to the external network, right? Because it's limited. You cannot; these are not routable. So it means that if I use a private, I can use the same private IP address as you right now. The only difference is that we're in different networks. In order for us to then connect to the external network, I need to use NAT, or your network address translation. So that accommodates for better IP addressing schemes in that regard. So you've got class A, which is your 10s. Then you've got a class B, which is your 172s in terms of the private, especially 172.16 and then 172.31 as the end of that range. And then you've got the 192s, the 168s as far as your Class C is concerned. I think that's the more popular one when it comes to IP address configuration. So in my example here, I'm going to go with that one. And I'm also going to show you when you're going to create your DHCP that the range should obviously be aligned with the IP address that I've literally set up. So I'm going to go to Ethernet here. And then from there, I'm going to select properties. And then from my properties, I'm going to then select IPv4. So just double click on IPv4 and you're good to go. And then what you want to do is select, use the following IP. I'm going to go with 192.168. Here I'm going to go .0.2. I'm not going to go with 1, right? Because normally, remember 1 in my example here, the first IP address within any particular range or subnet is normally the one that is used to identify that network or subnet. So my .1 here would arguably be allocated to my router, which defines my network, or literally a layer 3 switch, which again, same difference, it defines the actual network at large in that regard. Then with the subnet mask, that's obviously going to be populated by default or automatically. All I have to do is just click in there, and then automatically the system will identify that, listen, this is a Class C IP address that you've just plugged in. I'm going to automatically give you a default Class C subnet mask, right? And then they haven't mentioned anything about a gateway, but I think it's still applicable for you to plug in there for a clean type of configuration. And then the same difference would apply for the actual DNS server. It's going to be the actual server address there. Right? So this is going to be .2. So you'll discover that this particular IP address configuration just incorporated for the second server, right? Which is going to be your member server, which also can act as a backup. The DNS for that server will be the same as this one here, because your main server is the one that we're configuring now. So just make sure that you've got an alignment in that regard. Whenever you're putting in the DNS IP address for the second server, it should be the IP address of this one, which is literally the main server that is there. Because remember, you obviously have to join the domain in that regard. We're going to OK this and then select OK again. What you can do for a screenshot as well to show configuration is just click on details there. You can then take a screenshot of this particular setup. So what I was mentioning earlier on in terms of the snipping tool. So here I can just type out snip. All right, so here's my snipping tool. I'm going to select that. Right, and then I'm going to select new here. And then here I can then take a screenshot of my server. So I can go all the way up here. It shows even the name of my server as far as my configuration is concerned. And then once I've got that, I can then save this as whatever activity that is there, and then this is what I'm going to plug into my folders. All right, so that's how you'd use the snipping tool if you've not used it before. And then so I'm going to know that. So we're good to go in that regard, right? So I'm going to close this, close that, and then also close that. So now my server has got an IP, right? Manually or statically assigned. Now I can add the roles, which now define what type of server this machine is going to be. So I'm going to select add roles and features. Right, once I do that, I'm then going to next that. And then I'm going to leave everything as is. So it's literally going to be a role-based configuration. So I'm going to next that. It will show you the actual server there. Note that the IP address is still the one before we've changed, because the moment you then restart the server, you'll discover that the IP address that we've just set up there will then be registered. So I'm going to next that. And then here is where I'm going to select which services that I need, right? So remember, Active Directory domain services for the DC role, DHCP for us to incorporate the scope, and then DNS obviously for that translation of IPs to fully qualified domain names and vice versa. So I'm going to go with Active Directory, the second option there, Active Directory domain services. But be careful about selecting certificate services. I think a lot of individuals, again, just select sometimes without paying attention, rather. So just make sure that you select the right roles there, right? So it's Active Directory Domain Services, or ADDS, right? So once you click on it, you've got your features. I'm going to add them. And then I'm going to go with DHCP, add features. I'm going to go with DNS, add features. All right. And then once that is done, I can then next all the way through until I look at installation. So I'm going to go next. Next. So this is just a bit of a summary now of what Active Directory is all about. That's another summary of what DHCP is. That's another summary of what DNS is. Here's your confirmation that these are the roles that you want to go with. Once you're good with that, all you have to do is then select install, and then we are good to go. So this can take a couple of minutes here. So I think while that is running, let me just stop my presentation and then look at entertaining any questions that any one of you might have at this moment. So let me just unmute your mics quickly here. Feel free to post on chat as well. If your mics are not working, that's another option you can use. Give me 2 seconds while I try and unmute your mics here. And then you can ask whichever questions that you feel are relevant. Okay, just give me 2 seconds. So here's mic, and then save that, and then go back to this. All right, what you got for me, anyone? Feel free to unmute your mics or raise your hand, and then go ahead. Questions, contributions, concerns, anyone? Questions, contributions, or concerns?
Hello, sir.
Connor, what's happening?
I just wanted to ask, when you were installing the operating system on the virtual machine, and you chose the disk, insert disk, where did you get that software from?
So you mean the server software? Are you on campus or are you at home?
I'm at home right now, sir.
So you can download that off the Microsoft site, the Windows Server 2016. Can you access chat right now?
I cannot.
You cannot. Okay, what's your email address? Or let me see, what can I do here? Because I can give you a link to the downloads, right? So can you just quickly pop me a mail? My email address is 17675.
Okay, give me 2 seconds.
Okay.
What did you say email address was?
17675.
Yeah.
At ieconnect.co.za. Can you just repeat that for me?
17675 at ieconnect.co.za. Yes,
please just pop me something, and then I'll send you the links for both the server and the client software.
Okay, I just sent it, sir.
All right, cool beans.
Thank you so much, sir.
Not a problem. Right, so if you're on campus, remember there's an FTP site as well. You can download the software from, which is 10.111.180.17. So that IP address again, if you're on campus, it's 10.111.180.17. Once you select or once you access that particular FTP site, obviously you need to type out FTP at the beginning there, your colon and the double slash, and then it will ask you for your credentials. First of all, it will ask you which particular browser you want to use. So you want to go with Chrome or Edge, whichever one. You select that, and then it will ask you for your credentials. So this is where you plug in your student number or your student number email. and then you will then enter whichever password that you use to connect to Wi-Fi and so on, and then be able to download your software from there. All right, so alternatively, you can download it directly off the Microsoft site, evaluation versions, right? So I think you're normally given, what, 180 days for evaluation versions. So you'll typically need, because this one is a POE, so probably you might still need feedback, but that's more than enough time for you anyway, because you get your feedback possibly in the next 2 weeks or so. And then after that, if there's a need to reinstall, blah, blah, blah. So it's enough time for you. So it's both versions, the enterprise and the server are all evaluation versions that you can literally install without any keys and then use without issues in that regard. All right. Any other questions, contributions, or any concerns from anyone? Before we just jump back to our server here. Are we all good? All right, so nothing coming in. All right, so that's good. So I'm going to just mute your mics again, because unfortunately, sometimes inadvertently, you get a couple of candidates just unmuting, and sometimes there's a lot of feedback in that regard. So I'm just going to quickly unmute, and then mute rather, and then a little later on, I'll unmute again if there are any questions in that regard. So we're going to go back to our server here. I think it's completed as far as install is concerned. So just give me 2 seconds while I share the screen again. Right, so there is installation is completed. So to show you, so with RAS, remember RAS is your remote and routing service, right? You can also run that on the second server, right? So it mentions here that the second server is obviously also going to be a DC, right? Which is a backup DC, and at the same time, it's also going to have the, it's also going to have the RAS component added into that as well. So you can always install that on that one, or you can also add it on the first one, because they mentioned that whether you install it on the first server in terms of the role or the second one, you're still good to go. So we're going to close this. And as you can see now, I've got my servers incorporated, the ADDS, the DHCP, and the DNS. Now we need to promote this, right? As far as setups would go in terms of the DC. So normally when you add your roles, you still need to configure as well. So yes, we've determined what type of server we want our machine to be, right? But at the same time, we'll still need to then look at additional configs to specify or to complete that specification. So you'll normally find there's a yellow triangle with a black exclamation mark inside there. You click on that, and then there's obviously going to be a list in terms of what you need to do. So with a DC, remember the first thing that you want to do is promote and actually specify a domain name, specify a password, and then literally complete your install. And then you've got completion of the DHCP configuration as well. So let's start with that. Whichever one you start with will still work. I'm going to complete my DHCP configuration there, and then just select commit, close that, and then I'm good to go for DHCP. And then if I go back here, what is left over is my promotion. So I'm going to click on that. And this is where I now specify what type of domain I'm going to go with. So remember, the first time you are creating a DC, right? This is our first server. So the first time we are creating a DC, we now need to add a new forest. But for the second server, you will then select add a domain or DC to an existing domain, right? So just make sure you get that part, right? Because this is our first server. On our first server, we are creating the forest, or we literally are looking at the main DC. So our option is going to be add a new forest, right? Because we're literally creating the domain from scratch. On the second server, what you will do is select add to an existing domain, right? As far as your setups would go. So I'm going to add a new forest there. and I'm going to call mine kincaidg.com there. I think they've mentioned, and in terms of what to use, I think they've just specified here what type of, I think just anything that is relevant. So remember, the naming convention needs to be proper, right? Because with domains, you got specific setups, the .coms, the .nets, the .edus, and so on. Just make sure that your format is correct, because you might end up getting errors towards the conclusion of this particular wizard when it checks for prerequisites. So make sure that you incorporate the right format. Just stick with the .coms, right? It makes it a lot easier for everyone involved in that regard. Then we're going to next this. Right, and once we next, that is going to ask for a password. Again, in my example, for simplicity's sake, I'm going to go with password 1 again with a capital P. So just wait for that progress bar at the top there to literally disappear, or to complete, and then we can then add our password. So once we've added our password, we'll then just next all the way through until we get to installation. So everything else would be automatically populated for you. Like, for instance, your net BIOS names and so on, which normally takes the first section of your domain name. Okay, so there we've got access now. So we can just type out, I want to go with password 1. Let me make sure that I type that correctly. Then I'm going to go with password 1 again. And then I'm going to next that. And then you just next everything all the way through. NetBIOS name, again, once that progress bar at the top completes, you'll discover that it will automatically populate the NetBIOS name for you. Like I was saying, normally the first part of your domain, there's the PinKG setup there. Then we are going to click on next again. Next that as well. Next that. And then this is where it checks whether you've done everything accordingly, right? So if you don't get an error here, then we're good to go. But if you do, then it means that it will obviously even give you a summary or literally a description of why you're getting a specific problem in that regard. And then ultimately, what happens is that you'll need to fix, if everything is then good to go, it'll give you, normally there's a tick there that will show that everything is good to go in that regard, or everything has been checked with no issues, and then we can then start the installation in that regard. All right, so there we go. So all prerequisites checked and obviously passed successfully. We can now install our particular ADDS function here. So again, just a couple of minutes while this is running. Normally, you'll discover that after it's done, it will ask for a reboot. And then the next time you're logging in, you're no longer just logging into the local machine now, you're logging onto the network or the domain that you just created. Remember, when we logged into this server, it was administrator, which is a local account with whatever password. We logged into the local machine, right? But then the moment you restart, you now have an option which enables you to log into the actual domain you've just created, and then also have an option if you still need to log into the local machine. You also have an option to do that. So it's more or less like you've got two ways of logging into the machine now, or the server, as far as your particular setup in that regard is concerned. All right. So I think that one is done and dusted as far as installation would go. Once we've installed, once we've gone in, we'll see again how we can then run the second server. I think I've completed installation of the second one, so that we can then have it join the domain as far as your particular setup is concerned. All right, so just waiting for completion here. Let me see if I can get the other one up and running. All right, so server one's just restarted there after successful installation. I think server two is trying to run as well in the background there. System's going to be a bit choppy because of resources here, but let's see what happens. Right, so it looks like we're good to go. Let's see if we add in our Control, Alt, and Delete here, what happens as far as our particular machine is concerned. So as you can see now, it no longer just is administrator. So I've got two options now, right? So to log into the actual network, which is our domain, which is the Kincaid G domain, obviously as an administrator, as far as the default setup there is concerned. And then I can also then use other user should I need to then obviously log in to or using a local account, right? As far as your machine there is concerned. So I'm going to go with our password one that we used earlier. All right, and then obviously that logs us in, right? Our server manager should pop up naturally. All right, so once that particular progress bar as well at the top there concludes, we should then see all our servers again. And then as long as there's no notification there where the flag is, then it means that we should be good to go. Let's just check once this concludes. Right, so there's all our setups that are there. So I think AD is good to go now. As you can see, no notifications as far as that particular setup is concerned. I think as part of 2.1 there's a setup of the DHCP configuration. So let me just quickly do that. I think obviously the first three possible bullet points there, and then the last one. I think the rest you can also do some research in that regard. So what you want to do is you want to, first of all, click where it says DHCP there, right? The moment you click on your DHCP, as far as your server platforms are concerned, on your right-hand side there, you should find the actual server listed, right? Once it's listed, you want to right-click on it, and then from the context or options menu that then appears, you're going to have your DHCP manager there, all right? You'll select that. And then now we can configure accordingly, right? So remember, your scope is just the IP address range you're going to be working with as far as your particular setup is concerned. So obviously, as part and parcel of the actual screenshots here, you want to make sure that the actual name of your domain there is distinctively visible as well to authenticate your particular screenshots. So they've mentioned here that the first 5 IP addresses on the subnet are excluded from the pool, which means that the first IP address that I used for the default gateway, then the IP address for the server, and then that would also look at .3, .4, and .5, right? Those are obviously going to be allocated, including I think .6 as well. Those are also going to be allocated to the servers as well as the client machines. So both your servers and client machines obviously going to have the IP addresses manually assigned in this particular instance in accordance to the actual assignment itself, obviously within the same subnet. So it means that if I'm creating my subnet, or if I'm literally creating my address pool, it should then range from, I think, about 7 or 8 onwards as far as configurations there are concerned. So I'm going to then expand that option. And as you can see, I've got a red arrow there. So it means that I still need to authorize this DHCP server in order for me to actually use it. Yes, we did commit it earlier, but I still need to authorize it because I need to have green ticks there, or literally a green light as far as setups would go, as far as this particular server is concerned. So what I'll then do is then right click on the server itself. From the context menu that appears there, or options menu, I'm going to go and select authorize, right? So I'll select authorize there. Once I've done that, I'll close this manager. Okay, so it's here. I was about to close the actual virtual machine. So I'll close this manager. Once I've done that, I will then go back to my DHCP manager here. And once it opens, expand it again and expand this part. Once it opens again, as you can see now, I've got that green light, which means that we can now start working with our scope. So I've got IPv6 and IPv4 incorporated there. I want to work with IPv4. So once I expand that section, I'll then right click where it says IPv4 there. And then again, from that drop down menu, I'm going to select new scope. Right, there's a wizard that appears. I'm going to next that. And in accordance to your assessment, I think they've mentioned that your surname DHCP there. So I'm going to go Karanganga, DHCP. So it's plus, right? So I think it's just one word here. And normally your description is just there to more or less assist with troubleshooting, right? So let's assume on campus you've got the 6 computer rooms. Those are 6 subnets. You can just have a description to say, okay, look, this particular scope that I've just created is for computer room 1. This other scope that I've created is for computer room 2, and so on and so on and so on. More or less for troubleshooting purposes. But if you leave it blank, it doesn't really change proper configuration of the actual scope itself. So I'm going to next this, and this is where I now dictate the actual range. So remember, we're in the 192 range, on 192.168.0. So we said that 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6 are obviously excluded there. So we can start from 7 or even 8 to be more specific, and then we can end at. They haven't specified where it ends. So we can say possibly about 90 machines, just for the fun of it. So that will end at 98 rather, as far as configurations there is concerned. So we can then next that. And then nothing has been identified as exclusion there, as far as the actual pool setup there is concerned. So we can then next it, but obviously if you've got a specific exclusion to say, okay, from that range that we've just created, which is this one, possibly maybe the first 10 need to be excluded from distribution and so on, we can then distinctively set it up in that distinctive setup as far as your configuration there is concerned. So alternatively, like I was saying earlier on, depending on the way you understand that last bullet point, like I mentioned before, first 5 IP addresses on the actual subnet are excluded from the pool. So here we're creating an address pool, right? So it means that the first 5 are excluded. It doesn't mean that 8 to 15 there is what is excluded as far as your particular set there is concerned. But or is it 8 to 13 rather? But it means that we are not even excluding the IP addresses that are supposed to be allocated to the servers, the actual machines, as far as configuration there is concerned. So we're going to next that. We'll next that as well. So here they've mentioned that your lease duration needs to be 6 days. So you just enter the number 6 there. We'll next it, next everything else. Here we can incorporate the actual gateway we used, which is 192.168.0.1. We'll add that. We'll next everything else. Next, and then finish. And then automatically, once that is done, we've got a scope that we've literally created. If we expand that, we can then check the address pool that is being mentioned here. So if you just click on it, it will now show you the pool that you just created, which is 8 to 98 in that particular instance, as far as your particular setup is concerned. So the DHCP configuration is done in that regard, so we can close that. And then what we want to do now is to look at the member server. So let's see if I just minimize this, is our member server running there? So let's see if we can connect to it. Hopefully our system is agreeable. Let's see if I can just double click on that again. Okay, so that one is that opened also, so I can close that. Right, so let's change the view here. We don't want an enhanced session because it's a bit warped. For you, you can leave it as is, but for the purposes of my illustration here, just to make sure that everyone can see, I'm gonna have to scale it down a bit. So I'll put it at 75%. So I'm gonna enter this particular server. And so this is our second server, right? So we're going to go password 1 again, and we want to now ensure that this server joins the actual domain we created earlier, and it becomes part and parcel of. Did I enter my credentials incorrectly there? So password 1. Okay, good to go. So just look at a few configs here as well, and then we should be good to go. Hopefully, with the kind of resources that I've got here, we shouldn't be more than about 30 odd minutes as far as the session is concerned. Right, so I'm just gonna yes that. Right, so remember, once again, your server manager should automatically pop up in the next couple of seconds, really. If not, like I mentioned before, you can always select the Windows button and then select it from there. Right, so first of all, remember, we want to manually incorporate our IP here. So we used .2 for the first server. We're going to manually incorporate ours here and use then .3. Right, so Ethernet. Properties. IPv4. And then use the following IP. So we're going to go with 192.168.0 and then 3 there. subnet mask automatically populates. Remember, we're using the same gateway, 192.168.0.1. And then remember, the DNS, like we mentioned before, is going to be the IP address of our first server, right? Which is .2. We okay that. We okay that as well. And then we can check all your details. And then, like I said before, you can always even take a screenshot of that as well as your second server IP address config. So what I'm going to do is, let me close this. So before we add, or possibly why we add roles here, let me just quickly say add roles. While we add roles, we can then configure on the first one, the OUs and the users. So it's going to be ADDS again for this one. And remember, we left out remote access, which is your RAS, right? So we're going to select that. There might be a pop-up. You can always just close that and then select your remote access again. Let me just close that. Right, and then select remote access once more, and then we'll next it. So remember, yours will have, I think, VPN configurations that are necessary there, if I'm not mistaken. Next. Next. So here, you're going to go routing as well. They haven't said anything about your web configuration. So your direct access, your VPN, which is your RAS there, and then the routing is what you select. You next that. Next, confirmation, installation. Right, so while this is happening, let's see if we can go back to the first one here. Where's our first server? There it is. So we want to, if you look at 2.1.1 of your assessment, right? So that assist with what's happening as far as the whole concept of your users and computers. Remember, with Active Directory, when you're dealing with a domain controller, literally what you're looking at is a machine or a platform or architecture at large that is then looking at a central management platform of all the users within that domain or network, as well as all the computer systems that are incorporated there. So you've got the computers themselves as the gadgets or devices, then you've got the profiles, and the users at large in that particular instance. So the option that we want to work with here, so just for argument's sake, you've got organizational units that identify possibly the students within the domain, and then possibly the lecturers, and then possibly the admin staff, if you're looking at an example of the setup that we've got on campus, right? So what we want to do is access the Active Directory users and computers platform, because we want to create an organizational unit. They've mentioned the main one, which is HO users. And then within that, you've got directors, you've got managers, and then you've got staff. So this is 2.1.1. So you go and select Active Directory users and computers there. And naturally, sometime this year, you'll find that the option pops up. Right, so there we go. So again, with one of the screenshots, once you've accessed, you need to ensure that the actual name of your domain is visible there. So if you expand this, you'll find that within the Kincaid domain, you've got your .com domain, rather, you've got your built-in, you've got your computers all the way to users. So we want to create a specific organizational unit, right? And then within that, sub configurations. So you'll right-click where your actual domain name is, and then from the options menu that appears, you'll select New. From there, you're going to go and then select organizational unit. So normally these organizational units are identified as containers of all configs that you want to look at, especially the actual users and computers as far as your particular setups are concerned. So by default, you also find that it's normally protected from accidental deletion, because once that, if that literally happens, it could be detrimental to the way in which the network is functioned across the board, right? But for the purposes of this assignment or task, I normally advocate that you untick it, just in case you discover that you made an error in terms of where this particular organizational unit was supposed to be created, or you missed out on spelling, or you missed out on configs, right? But like I mentioned just a couple of seconds ago, within the actual industry, if you're going to be doing this in your own workspace, you want to make sure that that particular option is activated or ticked, just to avoid discrepancies that can arise by that a literal accidental deletion in that regard. But like I said before, because what you'll discover is that should you then make an error in terms of spelling or create it in the wrong location, sometimes you'll obviously have difficulty deleting or literally trying to correct that mistake, and it becomes a bit of a cumbersome process in that regard. And so depending on how strict your markers are, sometimes you might lose marks in that regard because you haven't incorporated content accordingly. So I'm just going to untick that and then select it's HO users like that. Right, and then I'm going to click on OK, and then as you can see, that particular domain, organizational unit has been successfully created under my domain. So I'm then going to right click on that one now, because remember, your directors, managers, and staff are sub organizational units within that main one. So I'm going to right click there, go new, and then select organizational unit again. So I think our first one is directors. I'm going to tick that part, okay it, and then right click again on HO users, go to new organizational unit. This one now is managers. I'm going to untick that, okay it, and then the last one is going to be staff, right? And then I'm going to untick that, and then okay. So as you can see, this is the actual hierarchy that you're literally supposed to look at and follow as far as your particular setup there is concerned, just to make sure that we're all on the same page. So you've got the main one, which is HO users, and then underneath you've got directors, managers, and then staff incorporated there. So within the directors platform, I'm going to look at creating a new user there, which is director 01, just for illustration purposes. So right click on your directors organizational unit there, and then this time you're going to then go and select new user, right? So our user is supposed to be director 01 there, right? As far as a basic, excuse me, configuration there is concerned. So I think we can go and then select director. Oopsie, I think it's a small, it's small letter D there. So we're just going to go and select director 01 as far as your particular setup there is concerned. And I think when it comes to the actual logon name, we can just stick to director 01 as well. We'll next that. Right, and then password. Did they mention anything about your passwords here? I think you'll change the passwords the first time they log in, right? Just for argument's sake. So I'm just going to go with password 1 again here. And then confirm the password. Okay, system's a bit choppy now. Password 1 as well. User must change, so we'll keep it as is. We'll next it. Gives a bit of a summary, and then we'll finish that. So just also be careful about the actual passwords in terms of just making sure that you use content that you obviously do not forget. If I'm not mistaken, towards the end, you will need to show using one of your clients, these particular individuals one of the individuals logging in, and then obviously changing their passwords accordingly. So we've got that done. So you can always take a screenshot of this as well in terms of your configs. So remember, the second server that we're running, right? The moment we complete installation of ADDS and also look at ensuring that it's added to an already existing domain, it should replicate what we've got here. Because remember, it's also acting as a DC. The moment we look at configuring replication in that regard. So this setup that we've just created should also be mimicked or shown on, excuse me, your second server. All right, so I'm going to close this as far as my particular setup there is concerned, and then possibly minimize the server, keep it on, go back to our second server, and still waiting for completion there. So just have to wait it out a bit. And then once that is done, we need to ensure that this server, first of all, joins the domain, right? And then we'll have the Active Directory role now distinctively, excuse me, set up as a replication platform. Right. Any questions so long while we are waiting for that installation to complete? Excuse me. Any questions, contributions, or any concerns thus far while we're waiting for that installation? Okay, so it looks like nothing's coming through. Okay, cool, not a problem. So let's go back to see what's happening. Right, so this might be a time you want to grab a cup of coffee or something while this completes. Right, so that's finally done. So I'm going to close this and then see if we can actually join the main first before we look at configuring your Active Directory setup. So as you can see, you've got your ADDS there. Now you've got your remote services also incorporated in that regard. So what we want to quickly do here is select our File Explorer, and then have us manually connect before we ensure that this becomes part and parcel of the domain we initially set up earlier. Right, so you're going to then select this PC. Let's go to Properties. And then from there, you're going to then select Advanced System Settings. Go to Computer Name. And then we're going to change the actual domain that we're in. So here, remember, we went with kincaidg.com. Then we're going to OK that. And then it's going to obviously look at credentials to enter that distinctive domain there. So ours was administrator. Password was password1. Let's just check that again. Yes, and then we're going to OK that. And then once that that's done successfully, it's going to then give you a welcome pop-up. So there, welcome to the kincaidg.com domain. So you might want to take a screenshot of this. We're obviously going to OK that. It's going to ask for a restart. And then once we've restarted, we can then promote that DC into a backup controller. So let that run again. Hoping that the restart process will be slightly faster. Let's close that up. Restart. So one other thing that you might also want to take heed of is that when you finished installing your operating systems, right? Because your particular ISO will still be inserted there, it will ask you to press any key if you want to boot from CD or DVD. Please make sure that you ignore that particular message, because the moment you select any key now, it starts the installation process from scratch again. So you just want to make sure that once your systems reboot, I think if you were having a quick look at this particular machine, there was that message that popped up right at the beginning. You want to ignore that and ensure that it continues to boot. Otherwise, you'll start the installation process all over again. All right, so that was slightly faster. We're going to go with action, control, delete, and you'll note that we're now part of the domain, but still our Active Directory configuration has not been configured accordingly. So we're just going to go and select password 1 here and enter. So while that is booting up, let me just quickly see if I can run ipconfig here. So cmd, let's run ipconfig just to confirm that we've joined that domain before we actually promote. So obviously, as you can see there, it's now part of the QKG, but now we still literally need to ensure that our Active Directory within this particular server is configured accordingly. So this is obviously one of the screenshots that you also want to take into consideration. So I'm just going to close that, and then what's happening with our notifications there, we'll need to promote this into a DC. But now remember, this time we're adding this controller to an already existing domain, because this is the second one, right? So let's see what happens here. So again, might just need to wait a bit for the progress bar there in your situation. And then we can just next and install. All right, so that's populated now. So literally, we will leave it as is in terms of adding a domain controller to an existing domain. It specifies what the domain is. We're going to next that. Right, it asks us to supply an actual account name here. Let's close that part and next it again. If it continues, then let's see if we can change that to administrator. And remember, we've been using password 1. Let's just confirm that password, we're okay it, right? Close that part and then next it. Right. And then we're just going to next all the way through after incorporating the actual password here. Right, so it's password 1 we've been using. Password 1. Password 1, the capital P. We'll next. Next. So this is where the replication that we were talking about comes in. And we'll also next that. Remember, if you go back here, right, you can also even specify which specific domain controller that you want to distinctively replicate from. So this is when you've got a lot of domain controllers within your configuration. If you want to look at it from a different perspective, you might want to then specify specifically which one it is. But in our scenario, we only just literally just have one DC that is there, so might as well just leave it as any controller and connect it from there. But normally, if you want to then specify which distinctive controller you want to look at, you'd want to then ensure that you select the right one in that particular drop down list that is there. So we're going to next that. Next prerequisites are checked. Once we get the go ahead, we'll look at a quick installation. Right, so that is sorted, all prerequisites checked, and then naturally passed successfully. Then we look at a installation of that replication there. So you'll discover, like I was mentioning a couple of moments back, that the moment we look at a reboot and then log into the second server, whatever we created in the first one. So remember, in the first one, we created the HO users. We also looked at the sub-organizational units, your directors, managers, and staff, and that specific individual or user account that we created, right? Once this concludes, once we log into the second server, or once we literally check your Active Directory settings on the second server, which is the one that's currently installing now, we'll then be able to replicate that. So whatever we created should also be shown directly in this particular server. And this is also one of the screenshots that you'll need to incorporate that will just confirm that configuration that has been undertaken successfully in your distinctive setup as far as configurations would go. So naturally now, because this is adding to an existing domain, might not take as much time as the previous install, but let's see what we've got there. Right. So one more point to note is that in order for the joining of the domains and so on, in order for the replication to take place accordingly, remember both your servers need to be on, literally. So that the server that you're replicating from, which is server number one, needs to be on in its entirety, especially when you're running the joining of the domains and so on. Is exactly the same thing for your client as well. In order for your client to successfully the domain, your server needs to be on as far as configurations would go. Otherwise, remember, even with the DHCP component and so on, if your DHCP server is down or if the actual configuration is misaligned, then it means that if you've got clients within your particular network setup that are supposed to be getting an IP address from your DHCP, then naturally what that typically means is that that particular join cannot be successful. So just ensure that when you're running this is the reason why we're mentioning right at the beginning that your resources need to be applicable in that regard, because all machines need to be running. So there will be a time where at a minimum, you'll have two machines running, which is the server, either the main DC or the second one or the backup, and your client, or literally have both of those servers running as well as the client running in that regard. So just ensure that you don't forget that fact that all of these servers, as well as at least one of the clients, need to be running in order for that network to be configured accordingly in that regard. All right, so there we go. Let's see what happens there with our restart. So remember, just another thing, when you look at both your clients and your servers, when you boot your machines and it says press any key to boot from DVD, please don't press anything because you've already installed your operating system, right? So don't press anything in that regard. Just let your server start up, because the moment you select that option, it means that you're reinstalling from the get-go. Right, finally, I think this is our last action. Let's see if we can win here. Then once that is done, we should be good to go. Right, as you can see now, it's no longer just administrators now logging on to the kincaidg.com. This is on server number 2. And then we're going to go with password 1, check our password again, hit enter, we log in, and let's check if we have done anything meaningful. And then after that, the rest is up to you. Right, up and running, up and running, up and running. Let's see what happens when our server manager opens. All right, finally. Let's wait for a couple of seconds until our servers are displaying, and then we can check if we've got some kind of replication that is there as far as our particular setup would go. All right, so we've got that incorporated. Is there anything else that still needs to be done here? Because we've got a notification. Oh, that's RAS. So I think that you can always set up later, right? So that's fine. Your RAS can be sorted. Let's just check now on our Active Directory setup. If we check our users and computers there, as far as our particular configurations are concerned, we expand the Kincaid G domain. As you can see, HO users has been replicated, expand the, got our directors set up, and that's our director one that we created earlier. So this is on server 2. All right, so replication done and dusted in that regard. So I think we're good. Done a chunk of the assignment there in terms of, because here what I wanted you to see is which part we're talking about. You see the new domain controller. So this is what we've just done, 2.3.2. Right. As far as someone's mic is on there, just check your mics, and then yeah, that's pretty much that. So you can always look at RAS and everything else, but I think the chunk of the assessment is done in that regard. All right, Kotatsu, your mic keeps going on and off. Do you have something to say? Okay, nothing coming through there. I think you've got a bit of a problem with your mic there. All right, Mohammed, what's our question there?
Can we get the video for the session?
Yes, most definitely. I think what I'll just do is I'll just cut out the lulls that were there, right? And then send it through a little later on today. What time is it now? Just gone past 1:08. I've got a lecture now. I'm actually late. So I'm going to jump into that one until about 5 o'clock, and then possibly later on in the evening, I'll send you that link, and then you can go through this content again.
Okay, thank you.
Not a problem. Right, anyone else with questions? Takane, are we sorted? Armin, Denisani, Kujo, and Kotatsu. Questions, contributions, concerns? Or are we good?
We're good, sir. Thank you.
Cool beans. All right, sorted. Not a problem then. That's fine. I think that's rather productive. So look through, just go through that content from the assignment point of view again. Make sure you understand exactly what you need to do. And like I said before, a little later on, I'll send you this link. Then you can go through it again. And should you have any questions, just pop me a mail, and then we can take it from there. But I'm sure your lecturer as well would be available for assistance in that regard. But otherwise, cool beans. Thanks for attending. Stay safe. Keep smiling, and enjoy your assignment. Cheers.